The heart of London in the mid-1980s was a place of sharp contrasts. The financial districts pulsed with a new, aggressive energy, a hunger for wealth that was both dazzling and ruthless. And in the shadow of this gleaming prosperity, in the affluent, staid neighborhood of Knightsbridge, stood a fortress designed to cater to that hunger. It was a place that didn't advertise its presence with flashy signs. Its discretion was its brand. The Knightsbridge Safe Deposit Centre, located at 6466 Brompton Road, was a temple of secrecy. For a fee, it offered anonymity, a metal box behind a formidable door where the wealthy could stash the physical manifestations of their fortunes and their secrets. It was a place built on one simple, unshakable premise, that what was inside was untouchable. I want you to picture the scene. It's a warm Saturday afternoon, July 12, 1987. The streets are busy with shoppers and tourists. The air is thick with the sound of traffic and the murmur of 1,000 conversations. The deposit center was on the ground floor, but it felt like a world apart. To get to the vaults, you had to pass through a security door into a small, sterile lobby. There you would be met by a guard, seated behind a protective screen. Beyond him lay the inner sanctum, a corridor leading to the vaults themselves, secured by a massive 5-ton steel door, a masterpiece of German engineering, controlled by a complex time lock mechanism and watched over by CCTV cameras. It was a system designed to inspire absolute confidence. It was a system that was about to be turned inside out. The two men who walked in that afternoon were dressed well, not ostentatiously, but with the quiet, expensive taste of money. They looked like businessmen. They carried with them an air of legitimate purpose. One of them, the older of the two, had a calm, almost paternal authority about him. His name was Valerio Vickay, an Italian playboy, a self-styled gentleman bandit, a man who saw the world not as a system of laws, but as a system of locks, and every lock had a key. His companion was younger, more physically imposing. They approached the guard and expressed an interest in renting a safety deposit box. It was a common request. The guard, a man named Michael Barlow, saw nothing out of the ordinary. This was the first and most crucial deception. They weren't there to rent a box. They were there to case the joint, to see the layout, to understand the procedures, and they were granted a tour. Barlow, following protocol, led them through the security door into the corridor and showed them the vault. He would have pointed out the security features, perhaps with a touch of pride: the thick door, the cameras, the procedures. He was demonstrating the center's strength, but Vickay and his accomplice were not looking at the strength. They were looking for the single critical weakness, and they found it. They saw the layout of the lobby, the position of the guard, the fact that once you were past that initial door, you were in a controlled, isolated space. They saw the human element. They thanked Barlow, were polite, professional, and left. The trap had been baited. The first move in their audacious game had been played. They returned less than an hour later. This time, they were not alone. 2 more men accompanied them, and this time, their purpose was not reconnaissance. It was execution. As they entered the small lobby, the mood shifted instantly. The veneer of civility evaporated. A pistol was produced. The guard, Michael Barlow, was suddenly looking down the barrel of a weapon. The threat was silent, efficient, and absolute. He was forced from his chair, his keys taken. He was a professional in a system designed to deter amateurs, but he was utterly unprepared for the cold, personal reality of a gun to his head. He was compelled to deactivate the alarms. The first layer of the fortress's defense was peeled away with a whisper and a threat, but the true obstacle, the 5-ton vault door, still stood between them and their prize. This was where their planning showed its genius. They didn't have explosives. They didn't have sophisticated thermal lances. They had something far more powerful. They had the key holder. Using Barlow's keys, and under the menace of their weapons, they forced him to open the massive door. I often think about that moment, The slow, heavy groan of that immense slab of steel swinging open, revealing the rows and rows of safety deposit boxes inside. It was a sound of surrender. The most sophisticated lock in London had been picked not with a tool but with the fear they had instilled in one man. What followed was a methodical, almost industrial process. They locked Barlow and the second employee who had arrived, a woman named Lillian Kelly, in one of the empty deposit boxes. It was a cruel, claustrophobic imprisonment, a calculated act to ensure silence and compliance. Then the real work began. They had the vault to themselves. They were like miners who had struck the mother lode. They used crowbars, sledgehammers, and drills to pry open the boxes. The sound must have been deafening in that enclosed space. The screech of tearing metal, the splintering of wood, the thud of heavy tool. It was a violent violation of hundreds of private worlds. And what worlds they were. The boxes yielded a king's ransom. It was a cross-section of London's hidden wealth. Piles of cash in British pounds, US dollars, German marks, Swiss franc, jewelry of breathtaking value, diamond necklaces, emerald bracelets, rings with stones the size of a child's thumbnail, gold bars, heavy and cold, stacks of bearer bonds which were as good as cash, illicit drug, dirty money, and clean money, family heirlooms and criminal proceeds, all stored together in a democracy of secrecy. They filled large, sturdy bags, their hands moving from box to box, their hearts likely pounding with a mixture of adrenaline and avarice. They worked for hours, lost in their harvest, the outside world fading into irrelevance. Meanwhile, the city went on, oblivious. Just feet away, through the walls, people were shopping for antiques, sipping tea in cafes, living their normal Saturday life. The robbers operated in a bubble of suspended time, a pocket of criminality in the heart of one of the most surveilled cities on earth. Their escape was as audacious as their entry. They simply walked out onto Brompton Road, melted into the crowd, and drove away in a waiting van. They left behind 2 terrified employees, a ravaged vault, and a scene of such staggering violation that it would take days for the authorities to even begin to comprehend the full scale of the loss. The discovery was slow, the investigation a labyrinth. The employees, once freed, were in shock. The initial police response was one of pure disbelief. The vault door was intact. There was no sign of a forced entry. It looked for all the world like an inside job. But as the story from Barlow and Kelly emerged, the true nature of the crime became clear. It was a heist of stunning simplicity and brutality. It wasn't about defeating the technology. It was about defeating the human being who operated it. The manhunt was international. Valerio Vicai, flush with success and hubris, became a legend in the tabloid. He was a flamboyant character, a man who enjoyed the fruits of his labor, driving fast cars and living a life of luxury. But his ego was his undition. He couldn't resist returning to England months later, drawn back to the scene of his greatest triumph. It was a fatal mistake. The net which had been cast wide finally closed. He was arrested in a dramatic shootout, a final, violent act in his personal drama. The official tally of the theft was placed at around £40 million. But those who know the world of safe deposits suspect the true figure was far, far higher. How much of the loot was from legitimate sources that victims were too embarrassed to report? How much was from the criminal underworld, who could hardly go to the police? We will never know. The Knightsbridge robbery was more than a theft. It was a dark mirror, held up to the city's soul. It revealed the fragility of the systems we trust to protect our most valued possessions. It proved that the most sophisticated security in the world could be rendered useless by a few determined men with a plan and a pistol. The vault door at Knightsbridge was a masterpiece of engineering, but it was, in the end, just a door. And every door, no matter how strong, must eventually be opened by a human hand. That was the weakness. And in the summer of 1987, in the heart of London, that weakness was exploited with brutal, unforgettable efficiency. The ghosts of that day still linger in the silence of safe deposit boxes everywhere, a permanent reminder that true security is an illusion, a fragile thing, easily shattered by the right or wrong kind of pressure.